You've been scrolling less, posting even less. The notifications still arrive, the messages still ping, but something fundamental has shifted. Where there used to be an almost reflexive urge to share, to document, to perform your life for an invisible audience, there's now just silence. Not the silence of discipline or some noble digital detox you're white-knuckling through. Something deeper. You look at your phone and feel nothing. Not anger at the algorithm, not judgment about wasted time, not even the guilt about neglecting your presence. Just a profound absence of desire. The impulse that used to animate your fingers, that used to make you reach for the camera at every meaningful moment, that used to translate your experiences instantly into potential content, it's gone. And what terrifies you most isn't that you're disappearing from these platforms, it's that you don't miss it. You don't miss being seen. You expected withdrawal, some kind of social FOMO, the anxiety of irrelevance. Instead, there's this unsettling piece. Like you've stopped speaking a language you never chose to learn. Like you've laid down a burden you didn't know you were carrying. And here's what you're afraid this means: that you're becoming isolated, antisocial, depressed, that you're giving up on connection, that you're failing at the basic contemporary requirement of maintaining a digital self, that something is broken in you, that you're losing your grip on relevance, on community, on the very fabric of how humans now relate to each other. You ask yourself in the quiet moments, am I disappearing from life itself? But what if I told you that this isn't disappearance at all? What if this silence, this withdrawal, this death of the performing self is actually the most honest thing that's happened to you in years? What if you're not losing your connection to life, but finally, for the first time, actually arriving at it? Because here's what nobody tells you about social media. It was never about connection. It was about a very specific kind of pleasure, the pleasure of being witnessed without being known. The pleasure of curating a self that exists only in the space between your anxiety and other people's attention. Every post, every story, every carefully composed glimpse into your authentic life was actually a defense mechanism. Not against loneliness, but against something far more threatening: the unbearable weight of existing without external validation. Social media promised you connection, but what it actually sold you was a more sophisticated form of hiding. Think about what you were really doing all those years. You weren't sharing your life. You were translating your life into a language that could be measured, quantified, reacted to. Every experience had to pass through this filter. Is this shareable? Does this make me look interesting, deep, successful, attractive, conscious, happy, struggling in a relatable way? Your actual lived experience became secondary to its representation. The meal wasn't about taste, but about the photo. The sunset wasn't about AEW, but about the story. The conversation wasn't about connection, but about whether you could quote it later. You were living in translation, and translation is always loss. Heidegger talked about das Man, the they self. This way we lose our authentic existence by living according to how one does things, how they expect us to be. Social media is das Man on steroids. It's a machine for producing theyselves, for turning your existence into a performance of what existence should look like according to an invisible, ever-shifting consensus. And the truly insidious part, it felt like self-expression. It felt like you were being yourself, but you were actually being the version of yourself that could survive in that dichotomy of attention. You were being the you that could be liked. And if you've been on this space for a while, you already know this isn't surface-level content. Consider staying. We go deeper into these territories every single week. You know where the button is. The pleasure you got from social media wasn't false. Exactly, it was real pleasure. The dopamine hit of a notification, the warm glow of positive feedback, the subtle thrill of watching your carefully crafted image be received, validated, affirmed. These are genuine hedonic experiences. But they're the pleasure of morphine, not health. They're the pleasure of scratching an itch that the scratching itself perpetuates. You became dependent on a loop: post, wait, receive, feel briefly satisfied, feel the satisfaction drain away, notice something new to post, wait. The pleasure wasn't in living, but in being confirmed that you had lived in a way that registered as valuable to the machine. Here's the diagnostic. You became addicted to your own representation. Not to social media itself. That's too simple, but to the version of yourself that existed in other people's attention. That version was cleaner, more interesting, more coherent than the messy, contradictory, often boring reality of just being alive. That version had a story, had meaning, had an audience. And you, the actual you, became the servant of that representation. You lived for it, arranged your actual experiences to feed it. This is what happened to you. You outsourced your sense of existing to a system that could only acknowledge existence in a form that benefited the system. Let me give you an analogy. Imagine you're born into a house entirely lined with mirrors. Every wall, every surface reflects you back to yourself. At first this seems wonderful. You're never alone. You're always seen. You can watch yourself exist from every angle. You learn to move in ways that look good in the mirrors. You develop a sophisticated understanding of your reflected self, which angles work, which expressions register well, how to compose yourself in the reflection. You become masterful at being the person in the mirrors. Years pass, you've built your entire sense of self around the reflected version. You know that person intimately. You've refined them, perfected them. The reflection has become more real to you than whatever is doing the reflecting. Then one day, you notice something. A crack in one of the mirrors. Not a big one, just a small imperfection that, for a moment, breaks the reflection. And in that break, you glimpse something you'd forgotten existed. The wall behind the mirror. Actual space. You become curious. You find the edge of one mirror and pull it away. Behind it, a window. You look through and see something that shocks you, the world outside the house. Trees, sky, weather, things that exist without being reflected. Things that exist whether you're looking at them or not. At first, this terrifies you, because you realize that while you've been perfecting your reflection, while you've been becoming the best possible version of your reflected self, you've been living in a house of mirrors, not in the world, not in reality, in a closed system where everything loops back to your image and the skills you developed. The composition, the angles, the presentation, they're useless out there. The world outside doesn't care about your carefully curated self. It doesn't reflect you back. It just is. You stand at that window for a long time. The wind outside moves the trees. Clouds pass, light changes, nothing is performing. Nothing is being witnessed. It's all just happening. And something in you recognizes this as more true, more real than anything you've experienced in the House of Mirrors. But Tand, this is crucial, it's also more frightening. Because in the mirrors, you had control. You had confirmation. You had proof you existed. Out there, you're just ... there. No likes to confirm your worth. No comments to shape your next move. No audience to perform for. Just raw, unmediated existence. This is what's happening when you lose the desire to post, to share, to maintain your digital presence. You've glimpsed through the crack. You've seen that the life you were performing, the self you were curating, the connection you thought you were building, it was all happening in a house of mirrors. And once you see that, once you really see it, you can't unsee it. The pleasure of the reflection starts to feel hollow. Not because you've decided it's bad or wrong, but because you've tasted something more real. And the artificial sweetness of validation becomes cloying, obvious, insufficient. Now, the typical response when people start to feel this is to try to make social media better, to use it more mindfully, to post only authentic content, to be more intentional about their presence. And I need to tell you clearly, this doesn't work. This is like trying to fix your relationship with the mirrors by promising to only look at yourself at certain times of day, or to only show your real self in the reflection. The problem isn't how you're using the mirrors. The problem is that you're trying to live in a house of mirrors. The very structure is the issue. Social media isn't a neutral tool you can optimize. It's an environment specifically designed to keep you in the loop of representation, validation, and craving. You can't mindfully participate in a system whose entire purpose is to make you forget what's real. This is the trap. You try to solve the emptiness of performative existence by performing authenticity. You try to solve the addiction to validation by seeking validation for your non-seeking. You try to escape the mirrors by creating a more honest reflection. And each attempt just deepens the fundamental problem. You're still living through representation. You're still translating life into content. You're still asking the world to reflect you back to yourself. The hunger perpetuates itself. What's actually needed is something that sounds absurd to the mind that's been shaped by digital existence. You need to stop being interesting, stop being witnessed, stop mattering in that particular way. You need to let your life become invisible to the machinery of social validation. Not as a discipline, not as a practice, not as another thing to perform, but as a natural consequence of realizing that your actual life, the one that's happening here, in your body, in physical space, in real time, cannot be captured, translated, or validated by the reflection, and more importantly, doesn't need to be. Let me give this experience a name: existential opacity. It's the state of existing without needing to be seen, interpreted, or validated by systems of representation. It's the opposite of transparency, of visibility, of the constant availability that social media demands. Opacity doesn't mean hiding. It means having a life that's too immediate, to present, too real, to be reduced to content. It means your experiences are for experiencing, not for translating. Your relationships are for relating, not for documenting. Your growth is for growing, not for narrating. Existential opacity is the quality of a life that's being lived instead of performed. Here's what existential opacity actually feels like. You're having a conversation with someone you love, really having it. Your phone is in another room, but not because you're trying to be present, because it genuinely didn't occur to you to have it near. The conversation moves through depths and shallows. Silences are comfortable. Laughter happens without you thinking about how you'll describe this later. Something tender is said. Something important is understood. And it never, not even for a moment, occurs to you to capture it, to translate it, to make it shareable. The experience is complete as experience. It doesn't need to be transformed into content to matter. This is existential opacity. The conversation happened in reality, not in the space of potential representation. It can't be liked, can't be reacted to, can't be validated by anyone who wasn't there. And this doesn't make it less valuable, it makes it real in a way that the performed version never could be. Or this, you're walking and something moves you. The light on water, the sound of wind, a sudden memory, you feel it deeply. The old reflex reaches for your phone. This should be captured, this should be shared. But then the reflex dies before it becomes action. Not because you stopped yourself, but because you realized the capturing would kill it. The experience is happening. It's whole, it's alive. The moment you frame it, compose it, prepare it for consumption, it becomes something else, something smaller, a representation of the thing instead of the thing itself. So you let it be. You let it stay in the realm of direct experience, immediate and unmediated. This is existential opacity. This is what life feels like when it stops being material for your digital representation. If you're still here, feeling this resonates somewhere deep, maybe it's time to stay. We explore these depths every single week, and you're already in the territory where most people turn back. The crucial thing to understand is that existential opacity doesn't depend on deleting your accounts, on some grand gesture of renunciation. It's not about absence from platforms, it's about presence to life. You can have social media accounts and still live in existential opacity if your relationship to them has fundamentally changed. If they've become tools you occasionally use rather than mirrors you live through, if your life isn't shaped by what can be captured but by what can be experienced, if you've stopped asking how will this look and started simply being in what is, the difference is profound. It's the difference between living for documentation and living for experience, between existing in translation and existing directly, between needing the world to reflect you back and being solid enough in your own existence that reflection becomes optional, peripheral, ultimately irrelevant. Now, I must warn you about something. When I describe existential opacity, when I talk about life without the need for constant witnessing, you might think this sounds rather boring, flat, unimpressive. Where's the excitement? Where's the color? Where's the proof that your life matters? The mind that's been shaped by social media craves intensity, novelty, the constant stimulation of new content, new reactions, new confirmations that you exist in a way that's valuable. And a life lived in existential opacity, at least from the outside, looks ordinary, quiet, unremarkable. There's no highlight reel, no proof of value, just experience happening, moment after moment, without the amplification of performance. And I want to validate that concern, because it's real. The transition from performed life to immediate life can feel like moving from color to grayscale. It can feel like you're giving up what made you interesting, what made you visible, what made you matter in the social economy you've been participating in. It can feel like becoming nobody. And the fear underneath that is, if I'm not being witnessed, do I even exist? If my life isn't being documented, is it happening? If there's no audience for my growth, my struggles, my triumphs, my insights, does any of it mean anything? But here's what you need to understand about intensity and constant stimulation. They're compensations. You need life to be exciting, documented, validated, performed, because you're not actually in it. You're skimming the surface, translating everything into content, living at one remove from immediate experience. The intensity, the color, the drama, these aren't signs of a rich life. They're signs of a defended one. A life that's running from the simple terror of just being here, unwitnessed, unconfirmed, uncertain. Social media doesn't enhance your life. It's a hedge against having to actually live it. Real existence, immediate present, unmediated, is actually more intense than performed existence. But it's a different kind of intensity. It's not the intensity of stimulation, of validation, of the next hit of social confirmation. It's the intensity of being fully in your body, in your relationships, in your actual experiences without the buffer of representation. It's the intensity of letting things matter without needing to prove they matter. Of feeling without performing feeling. Of being moved without analyzing how you'll describe being moved. This intensity doesn't translate to content because it exists prior to translation. It's the intensity of reality itself, which is always richer, stranger, more textured than any representation can capture. Let me tell you about Maya. She was, by all measures, successful on social media, not influencer level, but solid. 15,000 followers, good engagement, a carefully cultivated aesthetic that balanced aspiration with relatability. Her feed was beautiful. Her stories were engaging. She'd mastered the art of seeming authentic while remaining just curated enough to be aspirational. She told me once that she couldn't walk through her own city without evaluating every corner for its content potential. Couldn't have a conversation without part of her mind already composing the post about it. Couldn't experience heartbreak, joy, insight, or grief without immediately drafting the caption that would make it legible to her audience. Then, her father died. Suddenly, without warning, and in the immediate aftermath, in the raw chaos of grief, she did what she'd been trained to do. She documented it. Posted about loss, about love, about the fragility of life. The posts did well. People were moved. The comments were kind. And this, she told me, was when something broke. She was sitting at her father's funeral, present but also not present. Part of her mind already composing the post about how the funeral had been when she realized her father's death had become content. She was performing grief for an audience. And not insincerely, she was genuinely grieving. But she was grieving in translation, through the filter of how it would be received, understood, validated by people who'd never met her father and never would. She left the funeral, went home, and deleted the apps from her phone. Not as a statement, not as a dramatic exit. Just because she suddenly couldn't bear the thought of one more thing, especially her father's death, being fed into that machine. Weeks passed. The grief stayed raw, but something else happened too. Without the impulse to document, to translate, to make her experience legible to an audience, she started actually having it. The grief was no longer grief as content, it was just grief. Messy, contradictory, boring in its repetitiveness, crushing in its totality. It couldn't be contained in a post, couldn't be made meaningful through likes, it was just what it was. And in that space, something unexpected happened. Small moments started mattering in a new way. Her sister saying something funny through tears. The specific smell of her father's jacket, a memory arriving unannounced while washing dishes. These moments had no value to the machine. They weren't shareable. They were too small, too specific, too incomplete. But to her, living them directly without the imperative to translate, they were everything. They were her actual life. Not the representation of her life, not the proof of her life, just life itself, happening in its full, unperformed texture. She told me, months later, that she'd gone back to the platforms briefly, logged in to see what she'd missed. And what struck her was how hollow it all seemed. Not bad, not wrong, just hollow. All these people performing their lives, seeking validation for their performances, crafting themselves into content. And she could see it now because she'd spent months living outside that structure. She could see the translation happening, the lived experience being flattened into representation, the hunger for validation driving every post. She could see it because she'd tasted the alternative, existential opacity, life that happens whether anyone's watching or not, life that doesn't need to be witnessed to be real. She didn't become a digital ascetic. She didn't denounce social media or make some moral stance against it. She just lost interest. The same way you lose interest in candy when you start eating real food. Not because candy is evil, but because it stops satisfying once you know what actual nourishment feels like. This is the transformation that's happening to you, whether you recognize it yet or not. You're undergoing a kind of death. The death of the performed self. The death of the version of you that existed primarily as representation, as content, as image. And death always feels like death, even when it's necessary, even when it's making room for something more real. You're in the middle of that disintegration now. The old way of being, the constant translation, the reflexive documentation, the need for external validation is dying, and it's uncomfortable. It feels like loss. It feels like you're disappearing. But you're not disappearing. You're becoming opaque to systems that only know how to see representation. You're becoming invisible to machinery that only recognizes performance. And yes, this means you're losing your place in the social economy of attention. You're becoming irrelevant to the algorithm. But the algorithm was never measuring your actual existence anyway. It was measuring your performance of existence. Your willingness to translate life into content, your participation in the loop of validation. You're not losing your life. You're losing your role in someone else's attention economy. This is not a mistake. This is how it works. And here's the extraordinary thing that nobody prepares you for. The void you were afraid of, the isolation, the irrelevance, the disappearance. It's not what you find on the other side of the performed self. What you find is presence. Immediate, unmediated presence. The world becomes available again as something other than material for content. People become available again as something other than audience. Your own experience becomes available again as something other than performance. And this availability, this directness, this opacity to systems of representation, it's not emptiness, it's fullness. But fullness that can't be captured, measured, or validated by anything external to itself. If this is hitting different for you, if you're recognizing yourself in this dissolution, consider staying in this space. We go into these territories every week, and you're clearly already somewhere most people refuse to go. So what do you do with this? How do you live in the middle of this transformation? First, understand there's no technique to force this. You can't perform existential opacity. You can't strategize your way into authentic presence. Any attempt to do so just recreates the problem. You're trying to curate your escape from curation, trying to validate your non-need for validation. The very effort perpetuates the loop. This isn't a practice, it's a recognition, a seeing through. Once you see that you've been living in translation, living through representation, the translation starts to fall away on its own. Not because you're disciplined, but because it stops making sense. What you can do is very simple. When the impulse arises to document, to share, to translate your experience into content, pause. Not to suppress it, not to judge it, just pause and feel what's underneath. Usually what you find is anxiety about whether the experience is real if it's not witnessed. Fear that you'll forget if you don't document. Worry that you're wasting something shareable. Discomfort with being fully present without the buffer of representation. Let yourself feel this. The impulse isn't wrong. It's just a habit born from years of living in the house of mirrors. It weakens on its own when you see it clearly. Notice what happens when you let an experience stay in the realm of direct experience. When you don't translate it, don't document it, don't prepare it for sharing. At first, there's anxiety. The mind says, this won't count, this won't matter, you'll forget you're wasting it. Let that anxiety be there without acting on it. And notice what emerges underneath, the experience itself. More textured, more immediate, more real than any representation could ever be. Notice that it's actually enough, that it doesn't need validation to matter, that presence itself is the point. Stop asking your life to be interesting to an audience. Stop trying to make your growth, your insights, your transformations legible to people who aren't living your life. Your life isn't happening for an audience. It's happening for itself. For you, in the immediate texture of lived experience, and when you stop trying to translate it, when you stop trying to make it into content, it becomes available in a way it never was before. Richer, stranger, more sufficient than anything the performed version could ever be. What to stop doing? Stop checking how your life would look from the outside. Stop composing captions in your head. Stop evaluating experiences for their Stop comparing your actual life to other people's performed lives. Stop trying to make your existence legible to systems that can't see anything except representation. Stop feeding the machine, not as a discipline, but as a natural consequence of realizing the machine isn't feeding you anything real in return. Here's the final paradox. The way to have a life worth sharing is to stop trying to share it. The way to be interesting is to stop trying to be interesting. The way to matter is to stop measuring your mattering through external validation. When you live in existential opacity, when you let your life be immediate and unperformed, when you stop translating everything into content, something shifts. Your life becomes yours again, not in some precious, possessive way, but in the simple sense that it's happening directly, in real time, in your actual body and relationships and experiences. And this directness, this immediacy, this opacity to systems of representation, it's not a loss. It's the only place where anything real can happen. This isn't about losing your capacity to connect. It's about evolving beyond the illusion that connection happens through representation. Real connection happens in presence, in vulnerability that isn't performed, in being seen by people who are actually looking at you, not at your curated image. Social media promised you connection but delivered something else, an elaborate system for managing the anxiety of not being seen. You're not losing connection by withdrawing from that system. You're making room for something more real. For relationships that don't depend on documentation, for experiences that don't need validation, for a self that exists whether anyone's watching or not. The reason this feels so disorienting, so frightening, is that it's too simple. The mind that's been trained by social media expects complexity, expects technique, expects something to optimize or perform. But existential opacity isn't something you achieve. It's what's already here when you stop performing. It's your natural state before you learned to live through representation. It's what's been waiting underneath the performed self this entire time. You're not becoming something new. You're removing something false. And what remains is simpler, quieter, and infinitely more real than anything you could curate. Under all the documentation, all the performance, all the translation of life into content, there was always this direct experience, immediate presence, existence that doesn't need to be witnessed to be real. This is what you're finding as the performed self dies, not emptiness, not isolation, just the actual texture of being alive, unfiltered, unmediated, unperformed. And the reason this seemed empty, the reason it seemed like nothing, is that your attention was always elsewhere. Always focused on how things looked from outside, how they'd be received, how they'd register in the economy of validation. You were so busy translating life that you forgot to actually live it. But here's what's true. You're already there. You're already living in existential opacity.